Welcome, everybody, to Preservation Virginia's virtual tour of Bacon's Castle. Today, we're really excited. My name's Jennifer Hurst-Wender, and I'm the Director of Museum Operations. And I'm here with our statewide museum operations team, Lea Lane and Eric Litchford. And Lea, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lea. If you were on our webinar last week on the Treasures of Preservation Virginia, that you saw me already, but I'm our Curator of Collections.
And Eric?
Hi, my name is Eric Litchford. I'm the Preservation Projects Manager. Have not been on a webinar yet, but generally I manage the preservation efforts across our museum sites. And during the tour, I'll be talking about some of the architecture and the architectural changes that Bacon's Castle has gone through.
So just to give you a little bit of housekeeping and how this webinar is going to work. So we'll do, in just a few minutes, we're going to go ahead and play a pre-recorded video that we put together. And it's going to actually be a half-hour video. It's going to go by really quick. I was just watching it this morning, and well, if I do say so myself, it's fascinating and interesting. So I hope you guys enjoy it as much as I do. So after that video takes place, we're going to be here for a Q&A. This is a really exciting event that we're having. You have the curator, you have the preservationist, and you have me, and I've been around for over a decade. So hopefully we'll be able to answer quite a lot of your questions as we go through this process. I'm going to go ahead and get this video started. And Lea, Eric, and I will see you on the other side of the video.
Today we will be exploring Bacon's Castle. Known as the oldest brick dwelling in North America, it is a rare survivor located in Surry County, Virginia. It has been witness to a great deal of change since it was constructed in 1665. The rise and fall of family dynasties, wealth, poverty, the transition from indentured servitude to enslaved labor, followed by tenant farming and industrial agriculture. Bacon's Castle has survived through wars, rebellions, weather, and the ravages of time. It has been witness to the changes in technology and culture. Normally, thousands of visitors walk through this time capsule called Bacon's Castle. But as of right now, we are temporarily closed as we weather this pandemic. Bacon's Castle sounds ready to open its doors once again when the time is right. The name Bacon's Castle came from Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. Though Nathaniel Bacon, leader of the rebels, likely never stepped foot on the grounds of Arthur Allen's brick house, around 70 of Bacon's followers garrisoned there for around 3 months. The first time that Bacon's Castle is used in a public document referring to the house is in 1802, and the moniker has continued ever since. Bacon's Castle was built for prosperous merchant planter Arthur Allen, who had patented the land in 1650 and operated a mill on a deep creek on the property. Allen may have modeled his fine new home after some of the prominent residences he was accustomed to in his youth, like the Manor House and Gate House at Westwood Park. You can see many similarities to Bacon's Castle. Arthur Allen was baptized at St. Andrew's Parish Church, Droitwich Spa, in Worcestershire, England in 1608, and this estate would have been recognizable to Arthur Allen as a child. The home passed in 1669 to Arthur Allen II, owner during Bacon's Rebellion, and on to Arthur Allen III, to continue with successive Allen descendants with the last names of Cock and Robinson, until the house was finally sold out of the family line to John Henry Hankins in 1843. He and his family would undergo extensive renovations and restoration projects to the already ancient home. The Hankins, like many plantation owners, could not find a way to continue their way of life after the emancipation of the people they enslaved for free labor. As such, the Hankins foreclosed on their mortgage in 1872. The estate was purchased by William Allen Warren and descended through the Warren family until 1972, when Walter Pegram Warren and his wife Violet were killed in an auto accident. With no descendants, Bacon's Castle and 40 acres was purchased by Preservation Virginia, known at the time as APVA. Since purchasing Bacon's Castle almost 50 years ago, Preservation Virginia has been dedicated to preserving and researching this unique structure. As with all old houses, this one requires constant maintenance and diligent monitoring. Thanks to the work of our preservation craftsmen, past preservationists, and our current preservation projects manager, Eric Litchford, the castle is in good hands. Research is forever ongoing and constantly yielding its secrets. Thanks to the archaeologists, historians, and curators like Lea Lane, we are dedicated to continuing to grow our understanding of the people and objects associated with this place and our past. We are more dedicated than ever to discovering the stories of all of the people associated with Bacon's Castle, descendants of the people once held in bondage, the rebels, tenants, owners, and renters. Tell us your family stories associated with this place.
Originally, the main entrance to Bacon's Castle was in the center of the building and opened into the projected section called the Porch Tower. In the mid-19th century, a Greek revival wing was added to the east end of Bacon's Castle, and as part of that addition, the central door was removed and replaced with a window. Today, you can still see architectural evidence of the original entrance. A two-course brick band is visible that traces the path of an ornamental door surround. These bricks were cut flush with the face of the building at an undetermined time, but they originally created a projected door surround that carried the belt course that's present on the rest of the elevation around to the front of the projecting tower. Directly over where the door was located, you can see a triangle that outlines the location of a door pediment. The present cement coating was likely put in place to smooth over the rough brick surface that was created after the original pediment was chipped away.
Besides the physical evidence of the original ornamental door surround, we have one surviving visual documentation of its appearance. This circa 1815 watercolor, rendered by an unknown artist during the ownership of Richard H. Koch from about 1811 until his death in 1833. This is the earliest known depiction of the castle, and it is an amazing resource as we work to understand how this structure changed over time.
Through the front door is a small square room that was referred to as a porch in the 17th and 18th centuries. When Bacon's Castle was built in 1665, the porch opened directly into a large multi-purpose room called the hall. The porch likely functioned as a lobby area for the hall that helped formalize the space and manage interactions with visitors. This function makes sense with the architectural design of Bacon's Castle. Most 17th century Virginians lived in two-room frame dwellings that required landowners and their bondsmen to work and occupy the same spaces. Bacon's Castle, on the other hand, was consciously designed to remove service activities performed by the enslaved and indentured away from the main floors of the house and reserve the hall for family living and polite entertainment.
Bacon's Castle has one of the best documented interiors in colonial America. Scholars understand the lives and material world of a structure's occupants using primary sources like probate inventories, which are made after the death of the owner. Designated appraisers would go through the house and note anything of value, submitting them to local courts in the form of an itemized list. We're generally lucky to have one, maybe two surviving probate records for a property. At Bacon's Castle, we have 7 dating from 1711 to 1871. 3 of these, made in 1711, 1728, and 1755, are divided up by room, so we get an amazing window on the way these spaces were used and how this changed over the course of the 18th century. In our discussion today, I'll be sharing snippets from the probate inventories and how specific inventories were used as we furnished and interpreted the interiors. Not every room appears on every inventory. The only one that lists this porch tower separately was done in 1711, and all it notes is a parcel of lumber. There may very well have been other objects present in the room and in any of the rooms inventoried, but unless they were of sufficient value to the person examining the space, they weren't necessarily mentioned. It's also important to remember that objects move around. Things like candlesticks might be stored for the day and then distributed throughout the house when in use. Think of the inventory as a freeze frame on the moment the appraiser walked through that front door. The parcel of lumber might have been on its way elsewhere, either outside or to another room in the house. When Preservation Virginia, then known as APVA, or the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, began intense research on the house in the early 1980s, we commissioned a series of cutaway views of the structure. Some of these were furnished according to the probate records. You'll see these visual inventories throughout this webinar.
Sometime around the middle of the 18th century, Bacon's Castle went through a series of architectural changes intended to modernize the internal spaces. Where originally the porch opened directly into the hall, it now entered into a central passage that runs the full depth of the house. Central passages were a common feature by the mid-18th century, where the main rooms of the house were entirely dedicated to social functions. Passages allowed Virginia planters strict control over circulation and a more rigid enforcement of social hierarchy. The passage at Bacon's Castle was created by adding a wall across space that was formerly part of the hall, in effect making the room smaller. This addition of the later wall is noticeable in a few ways. First, the original west wall of the passage is made out of brick, while the new wall is timber framed. On the ceiling, you can see that the new wall was built around an exposed ceiling beam at an awkward midpoint instead of the beam terminating on top of the wall.
Elizabeth Bray married Arthur Allen III, and while we know little about Allen III, save that he was a justice of the Surrey County Court and that he married Elizabeth Bray in 1711. For the next 63 years, Elizabeth ran the family fortunes out of the chamber at Bacon's Castle. In 1727, Allen III passed away, and after skillfully settling the estate, Elizabeth retained lifetime use of Bacon's Castle and married Arthur Smith in 1730. She entered into that marriage with a contract that recognized her estate to be worth more than her intendeds, but also preserved it all for her and her children. Elizabeth maintained control of her own money while also receiving the maximum amount of Smith's estate. Arthur Smith owned the town of Smithfield and was a justice of the peace in Isle of Wight. During their marriage, Elizabeth endowed a school in Smithfield and oversaw the curriculum for both boys and girls. Arthur Smith passed away in 1754, and to this day, the 1755 probate inventory from his death proves to be an invaluable glimpse into a moment of Bacon's Castle's long history. It is from this probate that we see the addition of paneling, window locations, and room delineations changed and modernized as befitting her time. In 1760, well into her 60s, she married again to a Mr. Stith, whose first name is lost to us. He seems to have died by 1763, and in 1773, Elizabeth drew up her own will, outliving all of her children. She passed ownership of Bacon's Castle to Alan Cock, one of her grandsons, after her death in 1774.
The alterations made to Bacon's Castle in the mid-18th century changed the hall more than any other space in the house. The room was much larger originally, and no surface coverings were used other than whitewash on the brick walls and wood framing that enclosed the space. The exposed timbers were proudly finished with decorative chamfers and carvings. Moving into the 18th century, though, these finishes were going out of style as planters desired more refined interior spaces that hid structural building elements. The hall as seen today is how it appeared after these features were covered over by mid-18th century alterations. Full-height raised panel wainscoting with Balection moldings were installed into the walls. Above, the embellished ceiling joists were covered over with plaster and lath. The thicker beams did remain partially exposed, though the beams now come together off-center due to the addition of the central passage. A single window in the back of the room was removed and replaced with two new windows to match the two windows in the front of the house. Ghost marks in the brick are visible on the exterior that show this transition.
The furnishings of the hall represent the post-1728 division of the space into two parts. This newly trimmed-down space was filled with objects of sociability, as revealed in the 1755 inventory, completed after the death of Arthur Smith, the second husband of Elizabeth Bray Allen. Some of the furnishings had clearly been there for some time. The, quote, old desk and bookcase, and the old cane couch, and 16 oak-framed chairs, for example. Others were new to the inventory, including two oval walnut tables. The ones you see here are representative Virginia tables from the period, and a whopping 46 maps and prints. Since the adjoining passage doesn't get its own entry in the 1755 inventory, it's likely that a good number of these mini maps, prints, and chairs were displayed in that space as well. The old desk and bookcase apparently served as a means to store and display fashionable ceramics. The inventory lists 4 punch bowls as being on the furniture, which, given their size, probably means that they were placed on top of the bookshelf portion, a practice seen in prints from the period. The value of the bowls indicates that they were probably Chinese export porcelain. The tea table and tea service listed in the 1755 inventory that we used to furnish this room is probably the same one that appears in the 1728 inventory. In fact, there were 4 tea tables in the house in 1728. As tea drinking by the English was a practice that developed over the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the Allens were quite up to date by having such specialized furniture forms and ceramics dedicated to tea consumption at this early date.
The chamber, situated across from the hall, was also modified from its 17th century beginnings. The embellished framing was once again partially hidden, and wood panels were installed on the walls, though the paneling added in this room only rises to half height. Before even that, though, a series of small additions, called closets in the 18th century, were added off the back of the chamber. Archaeological investigations determined that the first closet was a post and ground frame structure built around 1700. This was replaced around the middle of the 18th century with a more substantial brick closet, roughly of the same dimensions.
Although we have left this space unfurnished, the chamber originally functioned as a bedchamber. In the 1711 inventory, the earliest which identifies the rooms, there are 2 beds with sheets, blankets, bolsters, rugs, and curtains. A massive amount of textiles were also stored in the room: 23 pillowcases, 48 napkins, 14 towels, and many tablecloths. There was also a still, as in for distilling alcohol, recorded in this room. By the 1728 inventory, this still had been moved downstairs into the kitchen. For Elizabeth, this room would have likely served as her office, a place from which to manage the complex functions of her estate. The 1755 inventory lets us see how she made this space comfortable and beautiful. It includes entries for a large easy chair covered in green damask, from which she could admire her print of the Duke of Cumberland on horseback and her seersucker window curtains. By 1728, the closet was listed as a separate space, filled with fine ceramics, glass, and metalwork. Also listed were 5 enslaved individuals: Hannah, Fanny, Harry, Adam, and Cato. It's unclear why they were listed in this space, but it may have served as their sleeping quarters. Enslaved persons often slept close to where their main work took place, so these 5 individuals might have largely worked inside the house itself.
The staircase at Bacon's Castle winds from the cellar up to the garret level along the inside walls of a projecting brick enclosure referred to as a stair tower. As with many aspects of Bacon's Castle, the stair tower is a rare early architectural form, few of which survive today in the Chesapeake region. The format of these stairs has some interesting social implications for how the inhabitants moved through the house. As the only staircase, it was the only means of moving between different levels of the house, including the kitchen workspace in the cellar and the storage spaces on the garret floor. This would require a higher level of interaction between the Allen family and their enslaved and indentured servants than would be seen later into the 18th century when elite Chesapeake planters tended to construct separate, further removed staircases for the servant class. Though in some ways the use of a stair tower does preclude this development by allowing the enslaved and indentured to move between the floors in an enclosed room isolated from the more formal areas of the house.
Born around 1651, Arthur Allen II, often called Major Allen, inherited Bacon's Castle in 1669. By 24, he was Justice of the Peace for Surry County, and at 25 years of age, he was swept up in the events that would become known as Bacon's Rebellion. Voting against sending supplies to Nathaniel Bacon in August of 1676, and being present at Jamestown when Bacon burned the town, he became a trusted officer to Governor Berkeley. and sheltered with the governor while his home was occupied and garrisoned by around 70 of Bacon's rebels. The rebels ransacked the house, drinking, eating, and stealing all that they were able for the next 3 months until the British Marines arrived to quell the rebels. In the years after Bacon's rebellion, Major Allen's fortunes dramatically increased, enlarging the holdings at Bacon's Castle from his father's 700 acres to 10,000 acres. He also improved the property. He's credited for having the famous 1.5-acre formal garden built on the west side of the house. He also had 2 brick flanking buildings built, enhancing the approach. Most recently, archaeology uncovered what appears to be an enormous 8-shaped hearth just east of the house. This may likely have been the first exterior kitchen associated with the site. Major Allen passed away in 1711, and his estate probate is used to replicate this over the chamber room.
In the western chamber on the second floor of Bacon's Castle, modern finishes were removed to restore the room entirely to its 17th century appearance. The ceiling has molded beams similar to the rooms downstairs, but with ogee chamfers instead of ovalo and without the central flower carving. The ceiling joists too are revealed and display a decorative rebate plain down the center of each member. Most of the fireplaces in Bacon's Castle were progressively infilled to create smaller openings through the 18th and 19th centuries. Here, the infills have been removed to reveal the original proportions of the 17th century fireplace. Above the opening is a massive oak lintel called a mantel tree. This too has a decorative chamfered edge, indicating that it was originally a finished exposed member. Though none of the originals survive, this room has reproduction leaded casement diamond pane windows to show what the windows looked like in the first period of the house. This type of window was commonly used in the 17th century before being eclipsed by wooden sash windows in the early 18th century. Fragments of the original casement windows have been found in the walls of the house and have been uncovered archaeologically.
The west room on the second floor is referred to in all the period documents as, quote, over the chamber, and was used as a second or third finest bedchamber for most of the 17th and 18th centuries. We furnished it according to the 1711 probate inventory, which was taken after the death of Arthur Allen II in 1710. Because Arthur Allen was older at the time of his death, we believe that much of what is listed in this early 18th century inventory was in fact the house during the 1600s, and the object types are consistent with that period. Like most 18th century bedchamber inventories, the bed itself was the most expensive item appraised. The reason was not the cost of the bedstead or the wooden frame, but rather what we call bed furniture, the bed, what we now call a mattress, pillows, bolster, sheets, pillowcases, quilt, blanket, and bed rug, as well as curtains and valances that hung around the bed and largely covered the wooden elements.
The east room on the second floor returns to how the building appeared after 18th and 19th century modifications, but 2 windows cut into the plaster expose some interesting architectural features. Like the fireplaces in the rest of the house, the mantel tree was covered over in the 18th century. Here you can see how the surface of the wood was scored so that plaster could be applied directly over the wood. Above the window, a different reveal shows where the top of the brick wall meets the timber roof plate. Interestingly, a row of stone tiles was inserted into the masonry wall. This was likely done because the height of the window could not allow for 2 full courses of brick to fit under the plate, requiring the use of the thinner stone tiles. Identical stone tiles were used as building materials in other locations throughout the house, and many have turned up in archaeological excavations. Many of the stone tiles recovered have nail holes in them, indicating that they may have been used as an early roof shingle.
Like the other large room on this floor, this space was used primarily as a bedchamber, with the 1711 inventory including a high bedstead and trundle with all those textile furnishings. There's also quite a bit of storage going on here, from clothing to earthenware, nails, sifters, and lanterns. Later inventories mostly list more consistently typical bedchamber objects. Both second-floor bedchambers have numerous chairs, indicating that these weren't used as a strictly private space, but could fill social functions as well. Over the porch is first designated in the 1728 inventory, and like most of the rooms, contained a bed and furniture. This relatively small space also held 4 leather chairs, 1 oval table, and 2 tea tables. By 1755, it seems to have been mostly storage, holding an old bed bolster, pottery, and some very old pictures.
Preservation Virginia had the opportunity to work with historian Peyton Young to help us uncover some of the stories of African and African Americans that lived at Bacon's Castle. To quote her, "The stories of the African and African American history at Bacon's Castle are incredibly rich. It is filled with stories of the families that were built under enslavement, the experiences of those who risked their lives to fight against the institution of slavery, and the people who created new lives and tight family units, which grew during the Reconstruction era and into the 20th and 21st centuries." Slavery was legalized by the Surry County Legislature around 1652. However, we have found no definitive proof that Arthur Allen owned any enslaved people. Arthur Allen II was the first person to be recorded as having owned enslaved people on the property during a transition from white indentured labor to enslaved African labor. Between 1650 and 1715, the Virginia General Assembly began establishing Virginia's Black Codes, a set of laws that cemented the slavery status of Africans and people of African descent. Allen II had a mixture of both white indentured servants and black enslaved people working on the Bacon's Castle property from 1673 to 1710. This garret space would have served as a place for enslaved and indentured servants to sleep, though this space is not their quarters and would have been storage space when not used for sleeping.
The 4 rooms on the garret floor were considered secondary spaces within Bacon's Castle, and this is reflected in the architecture. None of the wall surfaces were fully finished, even later in the 18th century when most of the spaces in the house were plastered or paneled. Even the exposed roof framing received a lesser treatment, with only a simple, flat chamfer applied to the ceiling joists. This level of Bacon's Castle is the only area where original floors survive, and they too have a less refined construction. The boards have random widths and are generally very wide. These type of features were less likely to show up on better rooms in the house. Unrelated to the status of the garret rooms, however, is the substantial roof framing itself. The roof framing is arranged in a principal rafter system. That is, large rafter pairs carry the weight of the roof, while smaller common rafters are interspaced, mostly to provide a nailing surface for the roof covering. The rafters are steeply pitched and taper as they rise to reduce weight. The large rafter pairs are connected underneath to a similarly sized tie beam to form a truss. The ends of the tie beam can be seen projecting from the exterior cornice of the house. This method of roof framing was used in the 17th century to span houses of greater depths. Its use continued into the 18th century, but as the size of elite houses grew, different framing systems that could span greater depths came into favor.
The garret was largely used as storage, but as Jen mentioned, it was also a sleeping space for indentured servants and the enslaved. Quite a number of textiles were stored in the garret, too, from linen to finished garments, including 2 greatcoats in 1711. Perhaps it was also a space for children. The 1728 and 1755 inventories both list a cradle, a child's chair, and a go-kart in one of the rooms. Most of the furniture, regardless of which inventory you're looking at, is described as old. It's probably not unlike our own attic storage contents.
Though Arthur Allen had lived in Virginia for around 15 years before his brick house was complete, the house is built similarly to an English manor home with a cellar kitchen. And while a kitchen keeping the house warm is great in England, in Virginia the heat and smells were intolerable. While this kitchen continued to be used through the middle of the 19th century, extant summer kitchens were quickly constructed on the property. Here, as in the garret space, changes in the roles of domestic servitude from indentured to enslaved and the changing decorum of enslaved labor are evident. Here they can be seen in the architectural ghostings, limiting access to the interior of the house and hiding the work of enslaved laborers. Through the elimination of the 17th century bulkhead and the later installation of an 18th century bulkhead, access points changed. The removal of interior stairs to the first floor and the creation of an exterior porch access show changes in the way people were able to engage with these domestic spaces.
The raised cellar at Bacon's Castle was one of the many features that put it in an elite class of 17th century architecture. The designated cooking area in the cellar, likely for the enslaved and indentured, was a development that was still uncommon in an era where most Virginians cooked, ate, socialized, and worked in the same room. Even the cellar rooms did not escape some level of modification through the years. On the rear wall of the cellar kitchen, ghost marks are visible that outline where the steps of a bulkhead entrance provided direct access to the cellar from outside. This entrance likely dates to the first period of the house, but was closed up in the 18th century. The west cellar room too had a separate entrance on the rear wall, though added at a different time. Archaeological evidence indicates that this cellar entrance was constructed in the mid-18th century. This set of stairs may have allowed movement between the cellar and the chamber above through the closet addition. When Preservation Virginia acquired Bacon's Castle in 1973, serious restoration work was required, much of it in the cellar where the framing was heavily damaged or entirely missing. A new summer beam was installed to support the joists, several of which themselves were replaced due to termite damage. The framing below the hall fireplace was burned and required splicing in new sections of wood. In other instances, metal braces were installed to preserve the original timbers but increase their structural strength. Repairs similar to this were performed throughout the house in addition to masonry repairs and modern infrastructure installation.
The early kitchen inventory, 1711, mostly lists the metal objects found there, a sign of their relative value compared to whatever else was present and wasn't recorded. There was a huge amount of pewter, 77 pounds of old pewter, 239 pounds of better pewter, plus 4.5 dozen pewter plates and 3 pewter porridges. Phew! The inventory also reveals other activities that were based out of the kitchen. There are 2 spinning wheels, as well as 2 old guns, presumably for hunting. After the 1740s, with the addition of a freestanding kitchen, the cellar space increasingly became used for storage.
Today, we have shown you just a sample of the stories to be told at Bacon's Castle. Preservation Virginia has been preserving this place for almost 50 years, and our research continues to grow almost daily. At over 350 years old, this intact structure holds our collective history, sometimes literally within its walls, and figuratively through the descendants of the people to whom Bacon's Castle is a part of their ancestry. To the many descendants we know and the family members we have yet to connect with, we want to know your family stories. We have spoken with many descendants of the people who once owned the property or lived as tenants, descendants of the groups of rebels led by Nathaniel Bacon, and the descendants of the African and African American people who were once held here in bondage. We look forward to sharing the stories we have with you, and we want to hear yours. Preservation Virginia is thrilled to be able to produce digital content like this program for you to enjoy. We hope that you did enjoy this virtual tour of Bacon's Castle. And if you're not yet a member, that you will consider joining Preservation Virginia, the oldest statewide historic preservation organization in the country, and support our work as we continue to preserve historic sites like Bacon's Castle, Smith's Fort, historic Jamestown, Cape Henry Lighthouse, the John Marshall House, and Patrick Henry Scotchtown. If you're not familiar with our statewide preservation, advocacy, and other initiatives, please sign up for our e-news and explore our website to see our efforts across the state, including our Most Endangered Historic Sites program. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you soon.
All right. Okay. So one of the very first questions that we have on here is related to the archaeological findings from Bacon's Rebellion, and what did we find? And this is actually coming to us from one of the descendants of one of the rebels, John Honeycutt. So we're excited that you're with us. So anybody want to, Lea, you want to take that question?
Yeah. So this is actually one of my favorite archaeological stories involved any of the Preservation Virginia properties. Back in the 1970s and 80s, we were doing a lot of investigations of the formal garden. There were some aerial photos early on, and I don't remember where in the presentation, but there were some aerial photos of the entire grounds. And as we were exploring the gardens, we actually came across some of these large deposits of materials, and they were in an extremely shallow depth, and they were all things that dated from right about the time of Bacon's Rebellion, including 41 wine bottles. And how they know which bottle is which is beyond me, but that's why they're archaeologists. They're amazing. And they were able to date some of those objects, and we realized that that's probably the deposit from when the building was occupied, and it was basically a trash dump. And so it's a wonderful window on that occupation, because Arthur Allen lost so much livestock, so much of his wine, and a lot of other consumer goods, especially textiles. They just ran off of those. But we're left with this evidence of their stay. So I hope your descendant, or I hope that your ancestor enjoyed his time and his wine. And we're grateful that he left the wine bottles for us to discover.
Okay, the next question I think is going to go to Eric, and it's what roofing materials were used over time in addition to the ones that were possibly the stone shingles that we found?
Right, so as you saw during the presentation, it is possible that originally the roof at Bacon's Castle had stone slates. That was a common roofing material in 17th century Virginia. But that's sort of a holdover from older tradition, as occupants of the Tidewater region sort of realized how wood rich they were, how much timber was available. They generally switched to wood shingles. In Virginia, at least, they were usually round butt, and for the most part, especially down in Tidewater, they were made of cypress. So it's likely that that would have been the primary roofing material for most of Bacon's Castle's 18th century life, and then I believe it had a metal roof into the 19th century.
And what is it currently? We brought it back.
Yeah. So we recently did a restoration on the roof, and I think this was 2017, it reinstalled a wood shingle roof.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's actually a Nootka cypress, which is, I think, also known as a yellow cedar or red cedar.
Yeah, Alaskan yellow cedar, I think is the species.
Right, which is it's a cousin to.
Yeah, very close.
To the local cypress.
It's pretty hard to find cypress these days.
All right, so let's see, going through some more of these questions. There's a couple of questions asking about our future restoration plans to the site. And so that's a two-parter, and I'm going to answer the first part of that. There's questions about would we be interested in restoring some parts of it, the front door, other aspects of Bacon's Castle to the way that it looked in 1665. And this has been an internal question that we have had probably for the entire time that Preservation Virginia has owned and operated Bacon's Castle. And my answer to that is that for a 350-year-old plus structure, our number one concern is all of the preservation work that needs to happen to it before we think about doing anything that isn't necessary. We want to make sure that our site is preserved. But I'll also let Eric answer that to talk about some of the preservation initiatives that are ongoing right now at Bacon's Castle.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I personally would love to see, the door return to its 17th century appearance, sort of restoration takes a backdoor to preservation. Right now at Bacon's Castle, we actually have a few active preservation projects. They are centered more on our outbuildings at Bacon's Castle, which we have a wonderful array of. But right behind the main building is a smokehouse from the 1820s. Late last year, we actually did a very large framing preservation project on it. A lot of the framing that was low to the ground had deteriorated, so the building was actually lifted up, We built a brick foundation underneath it, and then we're able to splice in new timbers for the lower framing members that had deteriorated. So with that done, the next big thing for that building is really going to be putting a new roof on it. It has, wood shingles that are very deteriorated, and it's going to be an important part of the preservation of that building to re-roof it and keep all the water out. And projects like this are generally funded by donors. So if anyone out there wants to help preserve buildings at Bacon's Castle, you can find donation instructions on our website. There is another building we're working on though at Bacon's Castle. Back behind the smokehouse is a building we call the 1701 barn. It's another outbuilding. It's likely a granary, so it's a building used to hold agricultural grain. It potentially could be one of the oldest surviving agricultural buildings in the American South. It's definitely a really cool specimen. You can see a lot of the architectural elements in it. It has a 19th century addition on the front of it that is also experiencing some severe decay. So we're going through and stabilizing that framing, and then putting new siding on it, which will help actually protect the 18th century core of the building. But yeah, so there's always preservation stuff going on at Bacon's Castle.
Yes, there is. So another question that we received is related to objects that are connected to people who once lived at Bacon's Castle. So Lea, can you talk a little bit about some of the pieces in our collection that we know relate to different figures in the house?
Absolutely. So over the past 50 years or so, there have been quite a few objects that kind of winnowed their way back. One of them really recently was actually a wrought iron lock that we believe originally was at the castle. We're not sure exactly when it was made, but it's great to have something that was so integral to the fabric of the place kind of back in situ. There's also a cradle that has a long history of having been in the house. So when you come for one of your tours, you can see that in the room above the chamber. And then there's actually a settee that came back to us from the Hankins family. They were some of the later owners, and so it's mid-Victorian. It's lovely. It's carved. It has very little to do with the earlier portion of the house, but it tells an important story about how the structure continued to function in the families that were residents later on in its history.
And I'd like to point out too, for those of you who have been following some of our digital content online, there's a video that Lea did on a silver spoon that was found in the walls of Bacon's Castle, in the wall, just one wall. But so that lives on our website. We have a page of resources, and all of the digital content that we've been creating is located on there. And the same for Eric's work. He's been talking a lot about the preservation projects on the 1701 barn and other aspects at Bacon's Castle. There's a great video about the red wash, but all of that information, and to answer another question that was on here, this presentation will also be listed on the website, so you can watch the video. I don't know if you're going to be able to get all of this Q&A, but you'll definitely be able to see that video on our website anytime that you would like, and share away. We're happy for that. You guys have been asking quite a lot of questions. This is wonderful. So thanks to everybody out there for all of these questions. All right, here's a pop quiz, Eric. What's the square footage of Bacon's Castle?
Oh, that is a good one. From what I can remember off the top of my head, at least the main body of it, excluding the porch and stair towers, I think it's like 25 feet deep. But that's the only dimension I can remember, just like floating in my head.
Okay. I think that with the 1854 edition, we're up to 9,000 square feet. And I believe, I want to say 5,400 square feet is the original 1665, but Don't put me on a test on that one.
The information's out there, it's just not readily available.
So we got a question all the way from London about the timber gable end over the entrance tower, asking if it would have been brick originally.
I think it is very likely that that was brick originally, especially if you look at the stair tower on the rear. It still retains a brick gable.
All right, it's great that we have people on this conversation all the way across the pond. So let's see. Somebody asked if there was a tobacco barn ever at Bacon's Castle. And I can kind of feel that question. The answer is not that we found, but that we do know that tobacco was grown at Bacon's Castle. And so there is an extraordinarily high probability, but just we haven't located it, and the building did not exist when Preservation Virginia took ownership of the property in 1974. But of all of there's the land around Bacon's Castle has been cultivated with many different crops over the years, wheat, corn, tobacco, and then in the 19th and 20th century, you would get soy and peanuts and cotton. And even today in the 21st century, the land around Bacon's Castle is still farmed with a rotating crops of soy and cotton and peanuts. So it's very agricultural, and it would probably, chances are extremely high there would have been a tobacco barn on the property. So there's a question about the last owners, the last private owners of Bacon's Castle, that was the Warren family, Walter Pegram Warren and his wife Violet. And the question is did they live in the house when Preservation Virginia, or prior to Preservation Virginia? They unfortunately died in an auto accident. And then Bacon's Castle went up for auction and Preservation Virginia ended up purchasing it. But prior to that, it seems like the Warren family did modernize the 1854 wing of the house. They had a kitchen, and they seem to definitely be living there. We have been in contact with one family specifically that is local and are descended from a family that rented out the older portion of the house, the 1665 portion of the house, while it was owned by the Warren family. So it seems like the older 1665 portion was rental property, and then the newer 1854 wing that was built by the Hankins family had been modernized in the 20th century and was being lived in by the Warren family. Previous generations of the Warren family did seem to use the castle as kind of a summer getaway or a vacation home. But also there were tenants that were living on the property and in a cottage. And the cottage is actually a really fascinating bit of architectural history that's attached to Bacon's Castle as well. If y'all can see the image, so the 1854 wing on the right-hand side replaced a older original edition that was put on sometime in the first half of the 18th century. And when the brick 1854 wing was added, the wood story and a half addition was moved a little bit over on the property and used as a cottage. And still to this day, it is a cottage that exists and has been modernized on the Bacon's Castle property.
I found a description, I guess it was yesterday, of the kitchen that the Warrens had. Apparently it was pink, this big pink kitchen. So.
Really? That's fascinating. There we go. That's a picture of the cottage when it was connected. Okay, so there's a question about paint analysis on any of the parts of Bacon's Castle. Eric, did you want to talk any about the paint that we found?
Sure. This was done a while back, but I believe all the paint colors inside of Bacon's Castle are all based on hard paint analysis. You know, we had experts come in, take samples, get those samples under the microscope, and then they can actually, you know, read all the layers of paint and determine, you know, original finishes. And we have replicated those colors inside the mansion. One of the cooler levels of paint analysis that's been done at Bacon's Castle is actually on the exterior. So originally, Bacon's Castle was covered in what you call a red wash. So all the messy brickwork and sloppy mortar joints were actually totally covered up with like a red. It's not quite paint. It's like a lime wash, but red. And then I'm not sure if it happened when the red wash went on or slightly later, but there was also like a white penciling to like sort of imitate fake mortar joints. And we had paint analysis done on that because some of it does survive in various parts of little crevices around the exterior of the building. And they were able to determine that the red wash, at least, was applied while the mortar was curing. So we know that was a 1665 finish.
So there's also a lot of questions about, you know, the people that interacted with Bacon's Castle, and there's a lot of questions about, okay, so we just talked about the 1665 portion of the house. What about the 19th century portion of the house? And the truth of the matter is that there are so many stories at Bacon's Castle, and there's no way that we're going to be able to talk about them all on this webinar. This was kind of an overview tour, but what we hope to have happen is we're going to continue to produce more and more of this digital content. We'll also get ready to conclude this webinar by saying that that we really appreciate all of you that are members that have signed up to help us as we preserve this place and all of the places that are all around the state. But that also, if you're not a member and you enjoyed this program and you enjoy historic places and you recognize their value, that you do become a member and consider donating to Preservation Virginia. We are the oldest statewide historic preservation in the country. We're a nonprofit, and I think you can tell by my colleagues that we really love what we do and want to continue preserving Virginia's history. So thank you all so much. Any last words from Lea and Eric? Nope.
Come
Thanks for
visit us
watching.
at the castle when you can. It's a wonderful place. It really quite an amazing structure.
Yeah. We hope to see you soon. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.